Hey everyone, it's Amy Sandler, host of the Radical Candor podcast, and we are so excited for this week's episode. But before we jump in, we've got Jason Rosoff with a very cool update to share with you all.
As many of our intrepid listeners already know, Kim and I co-founded the company Radical Candor 5 years ago because we believe that radically candid communication is foundational for success at work and in everyday life. Drum roll, please. And Radical Candor is thrilled to be a part of sessions by Masterclass to bring this message to the millions of users who are already Masterclass members. If you are not a Masterclass member, however, sign up using the link masterclass.com/radicalcandor.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Radical Candor podcast. I'm Kim Scott, co-founder of Radical Candor and author of Radical Candor and Just Work.
I'm Jason Rosoff, CEO and co-founder of Radical Candor.
And I'm Amy Sandler, your host for the Radical Candor podcast. And today we have got a really interesting conversation ahead about the difference between feedback and nitpicking. Kim, in the book, Radical Candor, you write, quote, "Radical candor is also not an invitation to nitpick. Challenging people directly takes real energy, not only from the people you're challenging, but from you as well. So do it only for things that really matter. A good rule of thumb for any relationship is to leave 3 unimportant things unsaid each day," end quote. Before we get into a definition of nitpicking, Kim, is there anything that, as you hear me reading that few sentences, that you would change, or does it strike you have a different relationship with that now?
I think it's more important than ever. I mean, sort of for the same reason that people often will misuse radical candor as an excuse to act like a jerk. They'll also think it means they have to start complaining about everything all the time. And that is not radical candor. That is nitpicking. Particular form of obnoxious
Nitty candor.
of obnoxious aggression.
Oh, so that's actually, let me so you think that nitpicking is a form of obnoxious aggression. Tell me more about that.
Well, yeah, it does feel to me like a form of obnoxious aggression. It because when at least for me, I'm sure we'll talk more about this, but for me, when you're nitpicking, you're not really so concerned about the other person. You're just like sort of giving voice to the little things that are bugging you. And it's usually there's also a lack of self-awareness often when you're nitpicking. It's not that you're so concerned about that thing. There's something else going on and you're almost hiding behind these little nits, I think. Although I'm sort of worried about using all these phrases often have these terrible backgrounds.
I think that is a great...
Okay?
Well, I don't know if it's okay. I do have a definition that it was first used, according to Merriam-Webster, in 1956 to refer to the practice of giving too much attention to unimportant details, especially as a way of criticizing, and that the word originated from the act of fastidiously removing nits, which are the eggs of lice from hair, which is a practice that takes an enormous amount of attention to detail. So I don't know if in that history there's anything else more fraught apart from the practice of lice control.
I will say, having had children who had lice and nitpicked, it's actually kind of important to pick those nits.
Well, this is why I think this is so interesting, and I wanted to highlight your original definition of leaving 3 unimportant things unsaid.
Yeah, so, lice eggs are important to get rid of.
That's like, who's defining what's important here? I think it is important to pull out those
particular nits.
Jason, where are you where are you on the great lice debate?
I think the question you're asking is what constitutes important.
Yes.
And I think there's maybe a subtle undertone or not so subtle undertone to the term nitpicking, which implies sort of hypercriticality. Like you're going too far to find something wrong. Like you're almost like you're trying hard to point out a fault, even in the face of evidence that that's not that important or not that big of a deal. Kim, you were making reference to this idea that it's often a sign of frustration about something else, and I think all of these things are manageable until they become, I want to call them sort of neurotic. And there's a Psychology Today article that we'll put in the show notes that makes the claim that hypercriticality is a form of verbal abuse. And I think we can all feel it when something switches from like criticism to nitpicking, because it feels personal, right? It feels like an attack, like you're veiling an annoyance with me by pointing out something small that could actually be wrong, but maybe is just sort of unimportant.
It is also, as you all were talking, both of you, I was thinking back to the lice incident in my house. and there did come a time when my husband had to pull me aside and say, "Look, we've got to stop now." Because I was ready. He was like, "We can't burn the whole house down." Like I was ready to take everything every piece of material in the whole house and like wash it and like fumigate the furniture.
I totally get that. I actually think this is a really potentially helpful metaphor, which is like the important thing is getting the lice, out, but then the impact might be when you go too far. And how do you make that distinction, which Jason is talking about, of when does it go from important on that spectrum of important to unimportant?
Yeah. Or just obsessive. I mean, I think
neurotic,
neurotic, yeah. I definitely veered way deep into that neurotic territory in that circumstance. And everything then that started to itch, like I was
I'm starting to itch just talking about it.
I think it's sort of instructive that the biological example, because as soon as you said that, I thought of a time when our dog that I had for many years, Phoebe, she got fleas, and it was the same thing.
Yeah.
Where you're like, I'm like putting her in and she hated the bath. She didn't mind getting sprayed off, but she hated being submerged in water. So I'm like holding her in the water. It was like and we were like washing and drying all of the things that we owned to try to like kill off the flea eggs and all this other stuff. And at some point it became like an obsession.
Yeah.
And it is a potential source of compassion for a nitpicker in your life might be that that they may not see that they've ticked over from helpful guidance into neurotic or obsessive, sort of abusive behavior, because from their perspective, it's like, oh, well, you take care
I'm being
of
thorough.
Exactly. You take care of the small things and the big things take care of themselves. That attitude can easily tick over into nitpicking.
Yeah. In fact, my son will be angry at me, but he had some chunks of dandruff in his hair the other day, and it was like I so wanted to go and pick them out. and I remember saying he's 14, like he's too old. I just need to let it go. It's hard when you really love someone and you notice some small thing wrong, and I and you just have to let it go. And now I've talked about it on the podcast. Really,
immortalized forever.
Would have been better to just pick that dandruff out.
The good news is that the overlap between your son's
his
social circle and the people who
listeners.
listen to the podcast is zero. There's a 0% overlap.
Yeah. Except some of their parents listen.
Didn't we talk about talking directly to people, not about people?
That's true.
I think that Kim, you might have to have a follow-up conversation.
I'm gonna have some.
But I think this is really important, because going into, Jason, what you're bringing in, which is impact versus intention. And so sometimes, my intention is I want you to go out and not have lice or whatever else is happening there. It's coming from the good place, but how it's landing could, especially if it's someone related to you. And so just, we've talked about, maybe somebody's getting excessively irritated. One example is irrelevant details or things that are minor and unimportant. From a work context, just to bring in a couple examples and then thinking, in the work context, why this happens. So, on page 10 of the report, I noticed you used the word compassionate twice. You should have looked for another word instead of repeating yourself. Or I notice you used a landscape image in your presentation instead of a portrait image on page 137, even though the client seemed to like it. I prefer sort of portrait images. Like, is that feedback? Is that nitpicking? Is that somewhere in between? I mean, if we're like, how do we on those specific examples identify, especially if it's measured sort of at the other person's ears?
As a writer, please tell me if I use the same word over and over again.
It-
That's to me, that's
Yeah.
not nitpicking, but I can see how in another context it might be nitpicking.
I think context is the word that matters the most here. So let's say that 10-page report is the vehicle that has landed you $1 million in business. The client is thrilled beyond words with
Yeah.
the presentation you have just made. And your reaction to that is to tell the person, I prefer portrait images. So please, next time, please remember that portrait images are better. And you did use this word twice. That in that context, it is nitpicking because
Yeah.
we've missed the broader content, the value of the thing that the person has done. And I think Brandy and I were having a conversation before the podcast, and one thing that she observed is that often nitpicking really does completely miss the care personally, right? It completely miss, and usually, a common source of care personally is acknowledging context. And that example where the 10-page report that the person made, equated to $1 million in business, but the only thing they hear is how they used a word twice, I think qualifies as missing the care personally.
Brandy, do you have an example of something like that?
You do. In fact, Brandy, we know you have an example, and we would like you to tell us about it.
Hold that on.
I do have an
Hopefully.
example. I'm coming out of my cone of silence, and I want to empathize with your fleas and your lice. And I'm going to admit
Yes.
this on the podcast that in 2007, my partner and I moved into a building with bed bugs, and we did not know. It was the worst experience of my life. We washed everything we owned. The cat almost died from the fumigation. And I was becoming so obsessive that he had to tell me, like, you got to stop. Like, I'll kill the bug when I get home if you see it, because I was just freaking out.
Yeah.
So
it's easy to
bridge too
become
far.
obsessive. Yeah. On these.
Yes.
I was actually riding on a plane with somebody who was going to the Super Bowl, and he said he was staying at a hostel. And I was like, oh, you're probably going to get bed bugs. Like, that's how far I was going with it. But,
that sounds amazing, except for the bed
yes.
bugs.
Yeah. He's like, oh my gosh, you're a Debbie Downer. But my story is when I was working at the newspaper, the publisher, we would have this, this was before we got sold, if you remember from a previous podcast, we were having an editorial meeting that we had every week, and he would go over all 6 papers and kind of critique them and say what he liked. But this week, the only thing he had to say was that he had an issue with a reporter using the word hopefully in their column, which means in a hopeful manner. And he thought it was lazy to use the adverb to describe a hopeful manner. And there was a better way of describing it. It went on for about 45 minutes.
He talked about hopefully for 45 minutes.
It was public criticism to a junior reporter who was one of our best writers, and really busted his butt every week. And that was the only feedback we got that week. So nobody ever used the word hopefully again, but it did not feel like helpful feedback. It felt like nitpicking.
Everybody was demoralized.
Exactly.
Well, and I think that goes to, what Jason was saying about not having care personally. And Kim, you're calling it that. I think that's a perfect example of obnoxious aggression, and, how sometimes nitpicking or being hypercritical can be a form of bullying, even if that isn't the intention. That can be the impact. I don't know, Brandy, as you look back on it, was there any sense of intention versus impact in that experience? I mean, certainly the impact was landed as bullying, but do you feel like that was actually the intention behind it?
I don't think bullying was the intention. I think it was a bit of I'm going to give you all a grammar lesson kind of high horse platform. This person was somebody who often felt like he knew a lot more than everybody else and never missed an opportunity to let them know.
One of Kim's favorite characters, the bloviating bullshitter.
Except that this is just bloviating. The bloviating bully, actually, we'll call this person. And I think you all can tell me if this is nitpicking or a helpful distinction. But I think that what's going on here is this kind of nitpicking is that overlooks the important good work that's been done. It's not only like a lack of care personally, it's a lack of praise, right? And praise should also challenge, but like what encourages people to do more of the good work is to mention the good work. And so I think it's a lack of radically candid praise, an absence of praise, as well as an absence of care personally. Do you see what I mean by
Jason
the
and I are
distinction?
nodding, and we're.
I think that's so important. My reaction to that is like we say no feedback sandwiches. So like the idea is don't deliver these things at the same time. But when a person feels like you do not have a reasonably even-handed perception of both the good things that they are doing and the things that they can do better, it makes hearing either of those things very difficult.
Yeah, if not impossible.
Yeah.
So, Kim, I really appreciate you bringing that in, and I think that does go to this idea of, unimportant things unsaid. And so one of the important things being said is around praise. One of the things, Kim, that you've talked about was there's not a specific ratio of praise to criticism, but I know people always like numbers. And how do you think about quantifying, or at least in terms of emphasis, praise and criticism, so that those important pieces are being brought up?
I try to think about it in terms of focus on the good stuff, or make sure that you're expressing gratitude on a daily basis rather than boiling it down to a number. And this is part of the reason why I made that distinction between not enough praise and care personally, is that praise needs to do more than it shows you care, but it also shows that you're paying attention, that you really care about this person's work, and that you're noticing the good stuff. And I think that if your goal, especially if you're a leader, but no matter who you are, if your goal is to sort of paint a picture of what's possible, praise is really important in its own right. Praise is not merely the thing you have to do to show that you care so that you can get to the criticism.
Right.
Because if you say, Kim, I like your glasses, your book kind of sucks, but nice shoes, like that doesn't make me feel any better. But you got a nice ratio of praise to criticism. So the point is, you want to make sure that you are adjusting your mindset so that you are paying attention to the stuff you really appreciate. When my daughter was born, I was telling her this the other day, my son and my daughter were born at the same, almost the same moment because they're twins. But when the doctor handed me my daughter, I looked at her and she came out wrinkled, as babies often do. And I said out loud, "Oh, Margaret, your forehead is wrinkled." And then I said out loud to her, I'm not going to overly criticize you. I am so delighted that you're here, and it was really important to me. It has been all along. For a while, I actually kept a journal, a gratitude journal of the things that I loved about them and appreciated about them, to make sure that I was focusing on the good stuff. And it wasn't like I wanted to say, "Oh, I've said this mean thing to my just born." And it was particularly, I think, important for me. I mean, my son was born first, and there was another one so I didn't say anything to him. Not because I care less about him, but because it was
another work to do.
There was another child that to be pulled out.
You talk a lot about how being a boss is emotional labor.
Yes,
this was real labor.
Emotional.
Yeah.
This. Well, there was no labor going on. It was a C-section. But anyway, too much information. But the point here is that there's also and I think this gets into nitpicking. I think we have a bias to nitpick on the people who are sometimes most like us.
Well, I think as I look back and realizing on our last podcast, and Jason and I were talking about sort of our own inner critic, and my own inner critic / editor / perfectionist as I look back at my career, there probably have been maybe one or two slight moments of nitpicking if I were maybe one or two. But I think from an empathy builder, that especially, people and ideas that are maybe closest to us, how in a self-help way, if you spot it, you got it.
Yeah.
It tends to be the things that we realize are in us that we tend to maybe pick on just as much. So I think looking at why this happens, not from a judgmental perspective, but from a curiosity perspective, we all as humans have a negativity bias, and some of us might be even more on the hypercritical side, and I'll raise my hand there. Sometimes people might think they're being helpful if they're suggesting a better way or pointing out a perceived mistake. So the intention there could actually be quite positive. Some of us, are perfectionists and notice every detail, especially if we do come from a background of editing, et cetera. If we're really hard on ourselves, we tend to be hard on other people. And then I think there's a few other ones that, and Kim, I don't know if you want to bring those up about you're having a discussion that's actually not about the content that's presenting it. So did you have an example on that? Like you're maybe fighting about one thing while there's something else under the surface.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, sometimes you could be you're mad at someone for something that you haven't addressed, or at least there have been times in my life when I was angry. For example, I was at one point in a bad relationship, a bad romance, and I was hyper aware of Valentine's Day. And it really was not about Valentine's Day, but it was so much easier to fight about Valentine's Day than it was to fight about the fact that I was in a bad relationship. Like now that I'm happily married, I just don't give two craps about Valentine's Day.
Mm.
It can safely be ignored, and I think that often happens when I find when in general, I would say I'm sloppy and and maybe hyper uncritical of myself, and whatever. I'm a little sloppy, more than a little sloppy, and and I'm happy to make mistakes all the time, and move fast and break things as long as I'm not breaking people and society. I think that's okay. Anyway, I think that it's useful to be aware. For me, when I get fixated on something small, it means there's something much bigger going on that I haven't addressed. I've been ruinously empathetic / in denial about it.
Mm.
Jason, do you have a similar perspective on that or something different?
I think this is at least in the same vein, but I was remembering a moment in my career where I had someone reporting to me, leading a product management team. I had someone reporting to me who was really struggling reputationally in the organization. There were for whatever reason, my perspective, like unfairly, this person had gotten a reputation for not being sort of like super on top of it and in the details and really knowing what was going on. And we were preparing to present something to my boss. I mean, I went through with a fine tooth comb, like I went through this person's presentation. I picked out every single wrong thing that I could find that they were going to get, that they were theoretically going to present when they got in front of my boss. And we sat down. So I had this was document centric chat. So I was like going through and like finding all these things and like made all these comments. And then we had a time later where we were going to sit down together. And I remember looking at the person's face when they walked into the room, and they were just crestfallen. Like I could tell that I had taken all of the wind out of their sails. So they were aware of this reputational issue. And in my mind, I'm like helping them by finding all the mistakes. And the impact of that was to make them feel like I didn't have their back, basically, that I couldn't see like what was good about what they were doing. And I remember like we sort of like closed the laptops and we looked at each other for a second. I said, look, you're going to do fine. I'm pointing out these mistakes, not because I'm actually worried that they're going to catch them, but because like I was being overly reactive. And we took a step back and we said, what is the most important thing? There are 3 really important points to this presentation. We want to make sure that we hit those really clearly. Again, laptop closed. None of those things wound up being important. It's like all those small things that I fixed in the presentation. None of them wound up being important. What wound up being important was like we hit those key ideas, and that this person had full mastery of the details behind those decisions, those three key decisions that we had made. I remember being like, why did I choose, like, what gave me the idea that the right thing to do is like point out all the tiny little errors that appeared in this presentation? And it was like, I was trying to like protect them from an accusation of them missing some detail. And as a result of the approach that I took, I made it so that they were much more likely to make mistakes. Like, thankfully, they trusted me enough to like even show me that emotion, because I think someone else might have walked into that room with bravado and be like, "I totally got this. Thanks for all your comments." And they could have been inside. They could have been like completely freaking out. But at least they showed me that they were terrified and saddened by my reaction to the work that they had put in.
Jason, I think that is such a illuminating and helpful story. And I do think it actually dovetails with what we were talking about last time of for folks like me being, very critical of myself and how you will say things like, hey, you're going to do great, et cetera, sort of leading with the positive, as Kim would say, focusing on the good stuff, not the wrinkles. And I will say, you said going through with a fine tooth comb. So I think it's interesting how the metaphors of nitpicking continue to this day. But I'm curious now, like, how would you address this now? You've got document-centric track. There's clearly some errors or things that you feel like you want to bring to this person's attention. How would you go about doing this now?
I think what I would have said to the person is, look, I'm also nervous. And my instinct when I get nervous is to like try to control everything. And so if you catch me doing that, like, I want you to stop you. I want you to flag it for me. I want you to stop me and say like, hey, I think we're getting like over focused on some details and maybe we're going to miss something. Being nervous is not like a bad thing. And I was I was like trying to make it so that we'd make it impossible for anything to go wrong. But of course, things are going to go wrong. And so the second thing I would do is say, like, we're going to be nervous and we're probably going to make a mistake. And the most important thing when we get in there is like, you realize you've made a mistake, stop and say, wait a second, actually, let me rephrase that. Or let me go back to that piece of data and like reframe it. Don't take from what I'm doing, like, don't take from my nitpicking that every little detail is equally important. Instead, focus on the key things that you're trying to get across and make sure that those are clear. And I think if I could have done that first, it would have stopped me from feeling like I needed to nitpick in the first place. You know what I'm saying? If I could have admitted to myself, like, the reason, like, I'm afraid, I'm nervous for this person, like, that would have stopped me from nitpicking. It would have stopped them from going through the sort of emotional person in a whole journey that they went through, and we would have been much better off. But it seems trivial, but just naming what was going on would probably have been like a really easy way out.
I have a question, Jason. I'm going to solicit some feedback in real time here.
Yeah.
Because there was a time recently where I felt like maybe I did a little nitpicking. So when we were working on the masterclass script, I went through it with a nit comb, fine tooth comb. And I remember thinking, gosh, I'm not really walking the talk on, ratio of praise to criticism. And so I went back through and I tried to point out the things I did like as well as all the things I wanted to fix. But I also sort of copped to it in the email. I said, look, I made a bunch of changes. It's not because I don't love this. I do love this overall. Like, I tried to set context of the changes because I do think, my sense, the reason why I did that was that I thought that it was important to, in this case, I thought the nits were important. It was not nitpicking, but lice prevention. So what did you think?
So I think this is like one of those interesting challenges, which is when the thing that you're working on has to act as, I'm trying to think of a better way to describe this, but an analogy is like a user interface. Essentially, the script thing that we were working on was we were creating a user interface for the people who are going to participate in the recording of the masterclass session that we did. And when you're making a user interface, one of the things that you try to do is you try to make it so that the right choice is very obvious, right?
Yeah.
And so I that's the way I experienced you going through that script. Is you're like, okay, I'm going to try to make the right choice of what to say or how to phrase something as obvious as possible. And I appreciated the fact that you recognized that there were a lot of things where the masterclass writing team, their first approach was not, from your perspective, the most obvious sort of right choice that they could offer to someone going through the course or someone who's going to like read the script as part of the recording the session. And I thought it was quite helpful because you said something else in that email. You said the words like actually really matter here, and we know that we have struggled at times to make these ideas really clear. And what I'm putting into this is like the experience that I've had of trying to boil these words down to something that's actually as clear as we can possibly make it.
Yeah.
And I think from that perspective, it helps to uh, take some of the sting out of it. But what I will say is, as a person who's been on the receiving end of that, there are probably things in there that came across as sort of like nitpicky in nature.
And maybe they were actually nitpicky in nature. I don't know. But they probably were.
Again, when you're creating something that has to outlive the people who are immediately sort of collaborating on it, that has to work for a whole bunch of people who aren't sitting in the room where it's being created. I often wonder is there such a thing as nitpicking in that case? Because someone is going to have that react. You know what I'm saying? Someone out there is going to read it or is going to see it, is going to have that reaction to it. And aren't we better off sort of like having it ourselves? And I think the way that we are better off is that we take the moments in between the like identifying of the nits to say how much we really love what we're doing. We actually level back up to that care personally. We offer praise, and not just care personally, but we offer praise for the specific things that are really good about what we're creating together.
Yeah. My feeling in writing, like there's that famous story about Wordsworth who missed his family was going on a picnic and they went away and they were so sad that he wasn't coming with them on this picnic. And they were gone all day long and they came back from the picnic and they said, well, let's see the poem. And he had moved one comma all day. But I think there is an aspect of art actually that does demand nitpicking. And I was thinking about this one time. I was editing something that someone else had written, and before I gave him the document, which was full of, I track changes. There were a lot of changes. And before I gave it to him, I said, let me show you what my editor sends back to me in my stuff. Like, this is what good looks like. And like every word on mine was highlighted. And it doesn't mean that this is bad. This is just the process. And there was someone at Apple who, a designer at Apple, who would, every time a new person came to work for him, he would show him 2 notebooks. And he'd say, this is my no notebook. And it was huge. It had thousands of proposed projects that had been rejected. And he said, and this is my yes notebook. And there were 3 pieces of paper in it. So he had 3 ideas that had been accepted and built and thousands that had been rejected. And he said, this is how we operate. It doesn't mean that you're not doing great work when you get all. So I think offering that kind of context can be helpful for people.
Yeah, that word, I feel like it makes all it makes all the difference. Like the context in which you're operating. I think it was an act. It was an act of care. It was sort of like an act of like care to say, for you to show your work, for this person to share with this new, this new employee. Like, this is how often I get ideas through that. That is a demonstration of care, and it helps them contextualize the feedback that they might get. But my guess is that at Apple, it might have been helpful for people to remind their teammates that you are doing great work, even though your ideas are getting rejected. So my guess is like not just in that one moment when with the notebooks but like at other moments, it's probably would be important, similar to what you did in that email, to say, hey, actually, this is great work. We're not doing it, but it doesn't mean that
it's not great work. Yeah.
I think that's a really important point. And just to go back to whether it's creative work, written work, Jason, even the story that you shared about the crestfallen teammate, one of the things that the topic brought up for me was, as someone with a lot of background in communications and editing and printed, back in the day of printed pieces, when you couldn't have a mistake. And I was working on a project where we would keep delivering feedback about, this needs to be italicized and this needs to be, 1.5 inches between and spacing, and things that sound very nitpicky. But when it's a sign at a big event that's in 20 feet, like, you want it to say radical candor and not like sadical sander, like it just like there. So I think it does go back to, what you were saying, context and importance. And just Jason, just to bring it back to your example, I'm wondering, you got to a place with that person where, first of all, you named your own emotion, but you also got them to identify what's the most important thing here. And then you can go through the presentation and identify it. But I think I will say, as a mistake that I've made as an editor, is we tend to go right to, if I'm editing a document, I tend to go right to the crossouts and the negatives, and rather than calling out the praise. And so I think that is something that I have learned, because I think we sort of make this assumption. I'll speak for myself. I have made assumptions often as an editor that you go right to, well, if I haven't addressed it, that means it's good. And now I'm going to get to like the stuff that needs addressing, rather than naming the parts that are working well and being explicit, and how valuable that is for the person that just put all this work into something.
I was an undergrad, and I remember I had that terrible habit of like waiting till basically the last minute to do my work as an undergrad, as many undergrads do.
Yes. You were not alone in that.
Yes.
It was a Western philosophy course or something like that. And I remember like I put together this paper, and I was actually like quite proud of it. And the TA, I turned it in like it was like a week later or whatever. The TA handed it back to me, and it was like you were saying, it was like marked up. But at the bottom, like 3/4 of the way through, it like highlighted and underlined this paragraph, and he's like, "This is a good idea." Like this right here, like this is good thinking. And I remember having that same reaction that you just described, which was like I felt awful. I was like, "This is terrible." And he's like, "No," he's like, "I don't do this very often in undergrad papers." He's like, "You actually did something good." He's like, "Most of the time, I'm like barely making it through these papers, trying to understand what people are saying. Like, this is actually a good idea. It's worth following up on this." And I remember that the feeling of like initial gut drop of like all the red marks to the recognition of like what it actually takes to do good thinking. And I realized what had happened was I had spent a lot of time trying to get to that idea. Like that's what the rest of the paper was me like meandering my way to like an actual coherent thought that he then pointed out to me and was like, this rewrite it and write it about this.
And Kim, you often say how you're the editor, right? So I'm curious if, as Jason is talking, that idea of, it's really the editing that gets you to the good idea.
Well, I'm the writer. I mean, my editor's the editor, and the editor is the boss of the book. I'm just the
that's
writer.
what, as the boss, you are the editor.
Yes, as the boss, you're the editor. Yeah, and I think that part of being a good editor is not editing out the other person's voice, right? And making sure that you're honoring what that person is really trying to say, and that means doing exactly what Jason was pointing out, like pointing out the parts that are good, and trying to be. I don't think I succeeded in the master class. This is why I have some lingering self-doubt about my nitpicking in the master. I don't think I spent enough. I was in a hurry and I was stressed. And when one is in a hurry and stressed, one rarely does all the right things. And I don't think I spent enough time looking for this, pointing out the things I really did love about what they had done.
Well, it sounds like could be a good follow-up.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I think maybe we'll have them on the podcast and find out what they think. We'll solicit feedback from the masterclass team. But I think we talked about a lot of interesting reasons why a person might nitpick. So a little compassion for the nitpick Sometimes people are hypercritical of themselves, and we often treat others the way we treat ourselves. Sometimes people think they're being helpful. They really believe they're being helpful. They don't understand. Sometimes people are really mad about something else. They're fighting about who gets which pots and pans after a parent dies, and really what they're fighting about is their relationship, right? Not the pots and pans. So those are all sort of reasons for nitpicking. I think and those are sort of hard to recognize reasons, but the easier reasons. I think one of the hardest reason that we nitpick is bias. This is a common nitpick creator. Is a manager has someone working for them who is underrepresented along some dimension, and they don't have confidence in that person because they have some biases, and then they start to nitpick. This is called hypervigilance, and that is really frustrating for the person who is being managed, and it makes it impossible for them to succeed. Actually,
Well, it's really interesting because we were talking at the top around how that if you spot it, you got it. How we often, nitpick maybe people closest to us or people that are doing something that we know that we do that might be
Yeah.
annoying. So we're calling that out. But on the other hand, now you're talking about maybe the opposite side of that coin, which is someone is different from me doing something. And so whether it's conscious bias or unconscious bias, I am pointing out mistakes that this person is making because of that difference. Am I stating that right, Kim, what you're saying?
making not you, Amy, but one can make too big of a deal of small things as a result of bias. And as a result of, the usual kinds of bias, sometimes it's not racial bias or gender bias. Sometimes we work with people who we just don't like for whatever reason. And that can also create the conditions for nitpicking, because if I don't like someone, I'm prone to look for all the bad things. And that heightens my negativity bias. And it's hard to be aware of, we all think that we're even-handed and that we're not biased, or even if we don't like someone, we treat them with respect, but we often don't.
Just to kind of take that from the other perspective, Jason, how would you advise someone who might be the recipient of a lot of nitpicking? How can we set boundaries with someone who might have this as a tendency? And if you want to start, if you are the direct report and maybe your boss has nitpicking tendencies.
I'll be the boss, the nitpicking boss for a second. I think the most helpful thing that someone could do for me would be to point it out. Just say like, I feel like I'm getting a lot of feedback about some very small things, and I'm not sure if that's actually helping me make the work I'm creating better. I don't know if it's your intention, but it feels like you're nitpicking. Unless there's like some deep psychological reason why a person is like most people don't see themselves as nitpicking. And so just calling attention to the fact that this is how it's coming across would probably work for a lot of people. You may run into a person who vehemently disagrees with you and says, no, every single detail that I've told you about absolutely matters. In that case, I think depending on the relationship, if you're a direct report, there may be some other useful things you can do, like getting the perspective of somebody else about your work, which is what I was trying to do for the person on my team, but then I wound up nitpicking them also. But getting the perspective of somebody else on your team about your work can be really, really useful as a way for you to start to understand the difference between the things that are kind of nitpicks and the things that are actually useful feedback. Because it might be the case, if you're a writer, that those aren't nitpicks. And in fact, that the language choice actually really does matter.
As you're talking, Jason, it reminded me of a time when I was working at McKinsey for a summer, and the partner on the deal that we were working on, we were changing pie charts to bar charts and back again, and it was midnight, and they were trying to decide whether a pie chart or a bar chart was better. And really, I was like, who cares? sort of my attitude.
How does this matter?
And the partner, senior partner looked at me, and you could tell he really thought he was being inclusive, and by asking and he said, "Kim, what do you think?" And I was so tired. I just said, "I think you're nitpicking." And everybody breathed a huge sigh of relief, and he was like, "You're right. Thank you. That was really good feedback." And I always have felt more fondly about Mackenzie ever since. It was like, oh, I can say that. I can just come out and say that, and it was okay. So if you can't imagine yourself saying that, you might get in trouble for saying it, but you might not.
And Kim, where do people send their follow-up emails when they've shared that in a meeting? Nitpicking it.
Radical candor. If you get in trouble for pointing out nitpicking, I will listen to the story. I hereby promise. So you can send us a note telling me, say, "Kim, you gave me some really bad advice."
And just to close, I think, is it accurate to say that legitimate feedback is helpful, whereas nitpicking is not helpful and can cause more stress? Is that as a sort of rule of thumb for before we start combing through hair unnecessarily? Is that helpful?
Yes, there's so much I have a nuanced point here.
Okay.
Here's the nuanced point. Like, another way of saying don't nitpick or leave 3 unimportant things unsaid every day comes from a story. I was at a wedding.
Good. I'm so sad that we hadn't gotten here, but now I'm excited.
And the wedding was on an island, and the island had a weak septic tank. And I guess the septic tank was full to almost overflowing. And so there was a sign on the toilet that said, "If it's yellow, let it mellow. If it's brown, flush it down." And the mother of the bride was sort of was Southern and sort of formal, and was kind of embarrassed that there was this sign on the toilet. And the bride's godfather was amused by this whole situation, and he stood up at the rehearsal dinner and he said, "There's some really good advice on this island about how to stay married. The advice is, if it's brown, flush it down. If it's yellow, let it mellow." He said that was where he sort of said, you don't have to criticize every single thing you can let some things go. It's really good to get in the habit of letting unimportant things go. But sometimes, and this is the problem about radical candor, is there's always on the one hand, on the other hand, but like I need a fourth and a fifth hand. So sometimes something trivial and unimportant is bugging you. And if you have a close relationship with this person, it may be easier for them to change that thing than it is for you to change the fact that it bugs you, even though it quote unquote shouldn't bug you. And so, if my husband snores, I wake him up and roll him over because it bugs me so much, and he doesn't really mind that much. So I think you want to make sure that if something is really that is unimportant, is occupying a big part of your mind space, you want to tell the person about it, but own that the neuroticism. Like, I'm being neurotic about this, I'll admit, but if you could please not do it, it would really, it's really hard for me not to be neurotic, and it's a pretty easy thing for you not to do. So I think that's another nuance to all of this.
There's a helpful thing there, which is you're naming the impact of it, even though you're saying, and you're simultaneously saying the impact is not, it's not fair. It's not really a criticism of you. It's a thing that I'm struggling with, and you could help me. You can help me.
Yeah.
But I think the fact that you have enough awareness. Something we haven't really talked about is that one observation that I have is that nitpicks often fail to follow our corn structure. They often fail to follow the context, observation, result, next steps. But you did in your example just now.
Yeah, when you slurp your tea, it's not that big of a deal on the one hand, but it drives me irrationally crazy. So please stop slurping your tea. For example.
Exactly. And so I think
that one was really that one was really right at your lips there, ready to go.
Not that
I'm
any of you
putting my
all-
tea down right
None
now.
of you all slurp your tea. This is someone else in my life who I love.
Yeah. That's another. So if you are accused of nitpicking, I think it is often helpful to slow down and see if you can actually define what, especially that sort of like the results part. Because often nitpicks, it's like, true, yes, that is incorrect, but does it actually matter that it's incorrect?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
what is the impact or the result of that thing being incorrect? That was the mistake that I made in sort of correcting all the little errors in that person's presentation, was that the impact of those small errors was really negligible.
Yeah.
The impact of making a mistake on those 3 key points would have been serious.
Yes, which is the reason not to nitpick in a nutshell.
Well, on that note, I think it's time for a radical candor checklist.
Let's do it.
All right. Tips to start putting radical candor into practice. Kim.
Praise is important to paint a picture of what's possible and to show everyone what good looks like. Pay attention to the stuff you really appreciate instead of focusing on unimportant details. Remember, focus on the good stuff and give specific and sincere praise. You can also keep a gratitude journal if you feel like you're veering into neuroticism and you need to focus on the good stuff.
Tip number 2, if you're on the receiving end of nitpicking, let the other person know how you're experiencing their feedback. Often just naming it can help guide that person in the right direction. And if you're not getting that response, can be helpful to ask for someone else's perspective on what you might be doing and get another opinion.
Tip number 3, if you're wondering whether or not your feedback has ventured into nitpicking, plug it into the core and framework to make sure that you are offering a context, your observation, and especially the result. If you can't come up with a good result or impact from that thing being incorrect, then you probably don't need to say it. If your feedback isn't core and it's not kind and clear, it may be unimportant and can be left unsaid.
Tip number 4, just a little nuance on what Jason said. Your feelings matter. So if it's bugging the living shit out of you, you're allowed to tell the person that it's bugging the living shit out of you, even if it shouldn't.
I think what you were saying there, tip number 4 is important.
I think it's very important.
I think the difference is potentially if I'm trying to decide whether or not the thing I'm giving is really feedback for the other person, then I think I need to be able to fill the corn thing needs to work, and it needs to be like why it is important to them.
Well,
I think
but corn can work why it's important to you. Like when when we're working in the same office and you slurp your tea, it drives me bonkers. Admittedly, that's on me, but I believe it's easier for you to not slurp your tea than it is for me not to be driven bonkers. Like,
yeah, I think I don't think you're wrong about that. I guess what I'm saying is if the purpose of I think there's a recognition there that it's not feedback really anymore, because if the purpose of feedback is to be helpful to that, well,
it's helpful
I guess the argument,
to our relationship.
Yes. The way it's helpful to the other person is because you're making an assumption that they care about you and they wouldn't want to drive you unnecessarily bonkers. And so it's helpful for you to share with them that there's a small thing that they could do differently that would make it much
And by the way, maybe this isn't small
them.
for them. Like, I think the relationship could be, hey, this is something that, this relationship is important. It's a big deal to me. I know, as you like, it shouldn't be, but it is. It lands this way. But that way, it also might be a big deal for that person. Like, that might be.
Yeah. And in fact, in this case, what I learned is that the person had a problem with their teeth and they actually couldn't not slurp their teeth.
Yeah. And did that help you deal with it?
Yeah. Then I was like less annoyed by it. I mean, still slightly annoyed, but it didn't drive me apeshit the way it had before.
Well, words to live by.
And apeshit, a phrase Kim is referring to the practice of primates throwing their poop.
Yeah. As a means of expressing
Extreme frustration.
So that sounds like what I refer to as preferences, because Amy would often couch that kind of feedback for me. Like, it would be my preference if you X, Y, and Z. So I think it depends on your relationship with that person versus a stranger.
Well, and I also think Kim said something which is really important, which is like, I know this might not seem rational or make sense to you, but for me, it would be helpful while we're talking, I don't know if this is, moving into this new house in Ojai, Brandy was kind enough to come out and visit, and the trash, I don't think this is going to be for the air, but the trash, I'm not yet leaving the trash out because I'm not there for the week and it's a small rural road and I don't want to have like the trash bins just like in the middle of the road. Yep. And so there's all these lemons and there's all these lemons that are overripe and like rotting. And so I didn't want to leave the lemons in the yard waste bin because I was worried about, like, first of all, they're not supposed to be in the yard waste bin. And then do I have rotten lemons in the bin? And Brandy felt that was an irrational fear of putting overripe lemons into the yard waste. But we did resolve it by looking up on the purveyor's website of what could go into the yard waste bin. And if you're on pins and needles, as of January 2022, you can put fruits and plants. But like, I felt nervous about I felt really nervous about having these, like, first of all, putting it in the wrong bin, and second of all, having it just sitting there like infesting, going back to flies.
You do not compost, do you?
Yeah.
No.
You're going to want to become friends with compost.
I know.
Living out in the country, like the rest of us. Well, actually,
I'm city slicker.
Yeah. I think one of the most helpful things about this conversation to me is like, I do think that this is the source of really good relationships is you're in a good relationship when you can say something to somebody which is like I
feel really very uncomfortable putting these lemons into the yard waste bin. It makes me very nervous.
Exactly. Like, you've reached a point of real connection in a relationship when you can admit that neurotic thing to somebody and say, like, I don't know what to do. Is there any way that we could change something about this to make this a little bit easier, whether it's slurping or, where you put your yard waste or whatever else? Like I feel like it is so important to be able to talk about those things that are actually really hard, but on the surface seem unimportant.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is, because if something is really, if one is neurotic about something, it's very hard to change that.
Mm-hmm.
Preach. I've spent, you know what, Kim? I feel like you've just saved a lot of people like thousands of dollars in therapy. Like this is one of the things that you learn in therapy is that it is very hard to change things.
Really, I had to spend many thousands of dollars to get there.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because Jillian tells me this all the time since she started her practice in in Silicon Valley, and she would often she's a grief counselor, and she would often get people who would come into the process, and they'd be an executive or someone at a a tech company, and they would basically be like, I have these OKRs for this therapy process, and by this date, I would like to be this percentage. I would like to be this percentage closer to being well. And she had to be like, it doesn't always work like that. Like, it doesn't, like, I know what you're saying, and like I appreciate that you want this to be the kind of thing where we can like clearly measure progress, and there are going to be these big milestones, and they will happen, but it's often very hard to predict exactly when those things are going to change. And I think when you're living with the result of that, like you're in a relationship, especially if it's a close one, either like in an office space or something else, and you're living with someone on a daily basis, where it's just like fingernails on a chalkboard. You know what I'm saying? Like, it seems trivial, but it is in fact.
If it's driving you crazy, and it may I know I use that term advisedly. Like, it may be literally driving you crazy. Yeah. It is okay to say that. It's not okay not to say it, because it's going to come out in some other less controlled, manageable way.
Yes, that is the downside of the OKRs for the grieving process, is that people become frustrated that it's not changing at the rate that they want to change, and that judgment actually holds them back from continuing to like progress in therapy and get better. Like there's like a snowballing effect of bottling it all up.
Yeah. For yourself or for others. I mean, like, there are things that shouldn't bother me that just do. And it's part of being in a good relationship is being able to cop to your own nuttiness.
Yep. Well, especially if you're trying to get help. Especially if you're like, look, I'm working on it. I'm trying to not have this thing drive me. But I'm not there yet.
Yeah.
We hope you enjoyed this postscript.
All right.
For other tips, you can go to radicalcandor.com/resources, download our free learning guides. Kim was referring to our new Radical Candor on Masterclass. We're so excited about that. You can get our lit video book. That's LIT video book. We've got a workplace comedy series, The Feedback Loop, and more. Show notes for this episode, radicalcandor.com/podcast. And as we like to say, praise in public and private, criticize in private. So if you like what you hear, you want to focus on the good stuff, please do rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. And if you've got criticism for us, go ahead, email podcast@radicalcandor.com.
We really do want to hear your criticism.
We really do.
We really do. I'm serious. We walk the talk.
Kind and clear. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks for joining us. Our podcast features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff, is produced by our Director of Content, Brandy Neal, and hosted by me, Amy Sandler. Music is by Cliff Goldmacher. Go ahead and follow us on Twitter @Candor and find us online at radicalcandor.com.